We're going to continue right along with what is the 12th session on Mark. We covered the temptations in the desert by Satan of Jesus, and we spoke about the important passage in Ezekiel 34, which I call Good Shepherd passage, which is about um, my servant David, a soul shepherd, and the covenant of peace, and the beasts pacified, and the people of God being able to dwell safely. This is a very messianic image. They will be under the fig tree. In the Jewish tradition, of course, studying Torah, which I think is what maybe Nathaniel was doing in the first chapter of John. We'll have to discuss that some other time. But actually, in Ezekiel 36, which is a very important chapter also, there's talk of the Garden of Eden. So that I do want to say that in eschatology, in the ideas about the end time of God's salvation, you have a return to the beginning in Genesis. And so this pacified paradise garden is part of the image, and we find that in Ezekiel, and we find that in Jesus among the beasts in the wilderness with the angels ministering to him. And I want now to take some time to speak about a foundational chapter for New Testament studies. And I think that Daniel Boyarin, whom I mentioned in his book, The Jewish Gospels, a brief book, 100 pages or so, must reading, talks about this. This is the famous Son of Man passage. And what you have briefly is in Daniel 7, you have beasts coming out of the sea, a place of chaos and monsters. You know, you have stories of God, even before the appearance of Israel in the land of Canaan. The Ugaritic culture talks about cosmogonies, struggles between gods for dominion, and sea, Yam, is oftentimes an evil force, as is Mot, death. And so you have these beasts coming out, which represent empires that have oppressed Israel, you know, Babylonians, Medes, Persians, and then a lot of focus on the last one, which is the one the author of this part of Daniel is really interested in the Maccabee period. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, the manifestation of God, nicknamed Epimanes, the madman, because he was a little bit like Caligula, you know, a lot of delusions of grandeur, etc. And the gist of this chapter is that the topsy-turvy condition of creation, which is that God originally intended Adam, humanity, to have dominion over the beasts. But sin makes things go topsy-turvy, and the beasts are the ones who have dominion over mankind, both in the sense of sin, in the sense of political oppression of Israel, in the sense of all evil. And here they come out of the sea, only to have in this vision the dominion. This is a chapter in Aramaic, as we've stated, Shaltan in Aramaic, translated best in Latin, potestas. Dominion would be the best translation. In Greek, they translated exousia, which is the word used by Mark for Jesus' teaching in the synagogue, which most translations in English say he taught with authority, not like the scribes. But it's really not just authority, whether you have a nice voice or a deep voice or you speak with authority, but rather, we'll get to that chapter in a second, chapter 1 of Mark, uh, verse 21 and following. But this exousia is removed from the beast, this dominion is removed from the beast and given to one like a human being who travels on the clouds, one like a son of man in the translation. Of course, before that, you've got thrones being set up for the ancient or aged of days. The Jewish tradition, it would be two thrones, one for God and one for David. So it's a messianic throne, almost like sit at my right hand in Psalm 110 until I put your enemies for a footstool. And then there are fires and rivers of fire, and then myriads serve this aged of days, just like the angels seem to be ministering to Jesus in a very similar type of expression. Books are open, eschatological revelation working its way towards the end. And the dominion was taken away from the beast and given to one like a son of man. In Hebrew, it would be a Ben Adam, a son of Adam. In Aramaic, a Bar Enosh. And I was mentioning previously that in Luke's genealogy, which is in reverse order than Matthew, Matthew is from Abraham, David, Babylonian exile, Jesus. Luke is Jesus working its way back, and the next to last is son of Adam, and the last is son of God. So that Jesus is really the new Adam, the son of Adam. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. He's the new humanity created again or recreated in the image of God, which turns around this topsy-turvy perversion of the original order and intent. So dominion is restored to Adam, or the new Adam. And it goes on to say that this cloud traveler, like Baal, who is like a secondary god to El and then becomes the primary god, we won't discuss that now too much, but he approaches the Ancient of Days, and to him is given all uh, empire and honor and kingdom, and all the peoples and nations and tongues will serve him. His empire, it says in this translation, is an everlasting empire that will never pass, and his kingdom will never be destroyed. So this is incredibly powerful power given to this one like a son of man. And that's why I repeat that Daniel Boyarin, this Talmudic scholar from Berkeley, the Jewish Gospel, says that the real blasphemous or offensive appellative or title of Jesus that would have really gotten the religious authorities upset, and translated politically the Romans' authority for sure, is not so much Son of God or Messiah, but Son of Man. And what you have here is really an eschatological restoration of the original intent of creation. And so I think this is all behind these beasts. And we'll see this topic again and again. We're going to see it in the first exorcism, where reference to Jesus' exousia, authority or dominion, is going to be mentioned several times. It's really his capacity to overcome evil. We're also going to see it in the paralytic episode in chapter 2, where Jesus says this, so that you know that the Son of Man has exousia upon the earth to forgive sins. He then both forgives the paralytic and allows him to get up and walk, which is very similar, as I've said, to John's Gospel, chapter 5, where the Son of Man has been given power to judge, etc. And so, without belaboring Daniel 7 anymore at this time, we see that there's a lot of sort of iceberg submerged foundation to what is going on. We spoke about Jesus's revelation in the baptism. I would say it was a tremendous intuition of his sonship and messiahship, and the messianic passage that we mentioned all mind, the shadow of the cross already, my beloved son Isaac, uh, is a sacrificial theme. By the way, last time I mentioned this book on the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. The author is Shalom Spiegel. He wrote it in Hebrew, and it was translated by a famous Jewish author, Judah Goldin, Goldin, as the last trial. So I recommend that for all the Jewish reflection on resurrection regarding Isaac. And so I also want to mention as a preliminary thing that Jesus will probably, what he does is have confirmed his status or his calling or his nature by the specific powers that he exercises in healings. And again, I want to mention this great scholar that died some years ago, Hartmut Stegemann, whose book that I like is The Library of Qumran, on the Essenes, Qumran, which is the site of the Dead Sea Scrolls, John the Baptist, and Jesus. And one other thing, what he says, among other things, I'm not going to discuss many books in any detail from what I remember. Stegemann says that cures such as the leper in chapter 1, the woman with the blood flow in chapter 5, raising Jairus' daughter, that these demonstrate to Jesus that God is working again in the new creation. And for example, that the curse of the woman in Genesis, in childbirth related to sexual activity and desire, etc., has now been reversed. And that things have been made clean. It's also an eschatological idea at the end of Zechariah, etc. These are the works of the Messiah, by the way. If you read Isaiah 34, 35, and so the blind will see, the lame will walk. There's even passages in Isaiah, your dead will revive in Isaiah 26. So Jesus will be experiencing through himself this awakened activity of God after a long time. This is the really hoped for salvation, restoration of what was ruined in original creation. And Stegemann calls this a return to sort of a pre-Torah, or at least a Genesis 1 and 2, pre-fall Torah. So that the legislation, for example, in Leviticus, where foods are unclean and you have to keep separate and these kinds of things, that Paul talks against. He's saying that Abraham is before Moses. What God promised to Abraham cannot be undone by a law that came 400 or 430 years later. This is all eschatological return to the origin language, which, by the way, we're almost about done. When Jesus talks about a man and a woman join and no man can rent them asunder, he's going behind Deuteronomy 24, allowing divorce, to the very beginning in Genesis 1. Therefore shall a man leave his woman, his mother and father, and join his woman, become one flesh. And so that's an indication of this return to the beginning that is the hallmark of eschatology. So that's an introduction to what we're going to be seeing in the next sessions, God willing.